My name is Sanyu Majola, and I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and the School of Public and International Affairs here at Princeton. And it's also my distinct honor to serve as the director of OPR, which is comprised of an extraordinary set of faculty, research scholars, postdocs, and students working on some of the nation's and world's most pressing issues. Demography at its core is a discipline concerned with numbers and the qualitative meaning of numbers. And numbers, when it comes to populations, matter. They make people visible. They illustrate the lines of inequality and privilege. They track progress and regress in a people's outcomes. And they have the power to shape laws, policies, and regulations. In an era where gender and sexual minorities in the US and around the world are under vigorous attack, the nascent field of queer demography and this summit has never been more urgent and important. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Christopher Velasco, for his initiative to have this summit. Professor Velasco is an assistant professor of sociology here at Princeton, and his cutting-edge work lies at the intersection of global and transnational sociology, political sociology, queer demography, and the sociology of culture. It's been published in top disciplinary journals, including the American Journal of Sociology, the American Sociological Review, and Social Forces. We're really thrilled to have him as our colleague in the sociology department, as well as at OPR. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank him so much for his initiative, his hard work, organizing this summit and bringing it all together. And I also want to thank our staff at OPR, Kristen Neri, Shannon Peck, and Steve Mars, for all their hard work organizing the logistics for this summit and making it possible. They're poorly in and out of the room, but let's also clap for them. Yeah. And finally, I want to acknowledge and thank the co-sponsors of this event, including the Department of Sociology, chaired by Professor Mitch Danier, the Center for Health and Wellbeing, directed by Professors Janet Curry and Kate Ho, and the University Center for Human Values, directed by Professor Melissa Lane, the Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies, directed by Professor Wallace Best. I also want to thank and acknowledge Professor Amani Jamal, who's the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs, for her support. So let's clap for the co-sponsor. So let me hand things over to Christopher to officially kick off the summit.
All right, good morning, everyone. First, let me thank you all for being here, both the in person and then the hundreds of people zooming in from across the US and several countries around the world as well to participate today. And also thank you, Sonia, for that generous introduction, and also your leadership and support of this summit today. And also like to thank the OPR staff for doing an incredible job in making today possible. So we're gathered at this historic summit to celebrate, reflect upon, and critique the past, present, and future of queer demography. When deciding to gather us all here today, I had 3 goals in mind for this summit. First, we are at an important inflection point when it comes to the recognition of queer lives within the US and around the world. On the one hand, there's been tremendous progress in terms of recognition of same-sex marriages, the decriminalization of intimacies, and the expansion of queer identification, especially amongst younger cohorts. But on the other hand, threats remain. We can see this through the systematic erasure of trans youth, the persecution leading to increases in queer asylum seekers and refugees, and states re-entering the bedroom to regulate intimacies and reproductive technologies. It is important for us then to come together and evaluate the state of queer communities amidst these turbulent and changing times. And second, I want us to have a check-in as queer demographers and sort of have a state of the field conversation. This area of research is blossoming. It's only going to continue to blossom as national surveys start to incorporate questions of gender identity and expression, sexual orientation in the coming years. So that means we're going to see this field expand, but before this expansion, I thought it would be nice to have a check-in and figure out, what do we know so far? What are the big questions that we still need answered? And can we lay a foundation now such that the massive expansion of queer demography expected to happen is on firm footing? And third, I want us to demonstrate how the intentional incorporation of queer populations helps to enrich the entire field of demography. So while I believe we should study queer populations in and of themselves, what I hope today will demonstrate is that by doing so, any and all demographers will walk away today with a richer understanding of core aspects of demographic processes because queer persons were centered. Whether that be about survey design and the conceptualization and constructions of populations to begin with, demographic methods, health disparities, economic inequalities, family dynamics, and so forth, I hope that any demographer, regardless of substantive focus, will at least see one presentation today that will help enrich their future research. So to help me achieve this, we invited 13 scholars who I believe have made important contributions in this domain and have either charted paths or are currently charting paths that help define the state of queer demography. So we saw a range of scholars, pioneers and newcomers, those from the US and from abroad. So we will not only be discussing queer demography in the US, but we'll have comments about Sweden, Japan, Nigeria, and elsewhere. And importantly, I wanted to invite demographers and non-demographers alike. So although some of the presenters today may consider themselves gender, sexuality, or queer scholars first, for example, and not necessarily demographers, I believe their work has clear demographic implications. And as queer demography grows, I think it's important for us to be in conversation with, or at least have an understanding of, gender and queer work. Even though we may not necessarily see it in the pages of demography or presented at PAA, there's clear implication for how we think about queer demography from this other scholarship. So before diving in, just a few housekeeping notes I also wanted to highlight for today and how the summit will work. So aside from our keynote, there'll be 4 panels cohered around similar themes, but as you'll see, there's definitely going to be spillover throughout today. So each panelist will present for about 20 minutes. We'll be followed by discussing comments from a member of the faculty here at Princeton and either a postdoctoral researcher or a graduate student. And then we'll get questions from the audience, both here in person and also, as I mentioned, the hundreds of everyone on Zoom. And then we'll hand it back to the panel to address those questions. And then we also have breaks throughout after every panel, 30-minute break to foster conversation. My one request is that everyone's in their seats promptly at the time the next panel starts. That way we just keep on schedule throughout the day. Of course, if you need to get up and leave at any moment, feel free. Don't feel like you need to be trapped in your seat all day because it is a long day, so I understand. But now let's go ahead and get this exciting day started. So it's my distinct honor to introduce our first speaker and keynote today, Dr. Gary Gates. So for those who may not know, Dr. Gates is a pioneer in the area of queer demography. So all of us here today, and anyone doing queer demographic research has had to engage or must engage with Dr. Gates's work in some capacity. So this is because he helped build this research domain starting back in the year 2000 with his dissertation titled Essays on the Demographics and Location Patterns of Coupled Gay Men. Since that first publication, Dr. Gates has worked extensively to understand the contours of the US LGBTQ population, how to measure them in population-based research or population-based surveys, their family dynamics, health and well-being, economic inequalities, racial compositions, and so forth. So with the publication of the Gay and Lesbian Atlas in 2004, Dr. Gates literally wrote the book on queer demography. So while Dr. Gates's career is dotted with accolades, his proudest moment was attending April DeBoer and Jane Rose's wedding. Dr. Gates served as an expert witness in the case April and Jane brought in Michigan and eventually up to the Supreme Court that brought marriage equality to the United States. So the now retired, yet still publishing recipes about gravy as a renowned gravy enthusiast, Dr. Gates served much of his career as the Bradford Cooper Distinguished Scholar and Research Director at the Williams Institute at UCLA School of Law. In fact, it's through one of his reports that I first came in contact with Dr. Gates's work. So back in 2008, he wrote a snapshot report on the distribution of same-sex couples in Kansas, which is where I'm from. So as a high school in rural Kansas, I was dumbfounded to find out that I actually lived in one of the gayest counties in the state. And I was blown away, especially as a closeted high schooler feeling alone, to actually realize I was surrounded by this hidden community. And that was a clear, like an early indication of the power of queer demographic scholarship, in even this small, subtle way as a closeted high schooler in my small town. So now, 16 years later, it's an honor to finally meet the men who wrote that initial report and introduce our keynote speaker. So help me in welcoming Dr. Gary Gates.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here today. As Christopher said, I've been retired for nearly 8 years now, and I'm unusual, I think, a little bit in academia in that I took retirement fairly literally, and have sort of ventured into different paths, some of which you'll hear about later. And actually, you can see it's my affiliation. I now kind of on the side make wine, so it's great fun. But I am delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted to be here amongst a group of amazing scholars. And I think for those of you who don't know this group of people, I think I'm thrilled that A, they're just terrific scholars, but B, these are really people who are making our world a better place. They're making the world a more just place for queer people and a safer place for queer communities. And I'm thrilled to be in the presence of all of you. And I'm really excited to hear about all the fantastic work that's being done. I think because I am on the older side of the age profile here of attendees, I decided that for my talk that I would focus a little bit on some of the how we got to where we are here today. And in particular, because of my vantage point, to look at the interplay, the really constant interplay in this world of queer demography and science and politics. It's almost impossible to do this work without trying to think about and understanding the impact that it has or the effect that it might have on social policy and sort of politics in general. And my vantage point when I say that is back in my earliest days, after I almost became a Catholic priest, I ran a small, that's a whole nother story, but I usually best told over cocktails. But I ran a small aid service organization in Western Pennsylvania and then worked at the University of Pittsburgh. That was the home nursing agency. And then at the University of Pittsburgh, Stop HIV was, I worked at Pitt on a project where we worked with the Pennsylvania Department of Health to do HIV community prevention planning back in the 90s. And in both of those roles, I was continually struck by the lack of data and the degree to which data wasn't driving key decision-making around HIV and AIDS policy. It was shocking how much of it was driven to some degree simply by stasis. Money went somewhere, and once it got there, it didn't leave there for a decade, regardless of data. And there wasn't even, it was remarkable how little interest there was in expressing the need for data. So when I did my PhD, I was very clear when I started my PhD, from day one, I told my advisors, just understand, I'm not going to do tenure track faculty things. Like, that's not my plan here. That said, for 4 years, my advisors gave me career advice on how to get myself a tenure track academic job, which I ignored. So when I left and finished my PhD, I went to the Urban Institute, which is a big public policy research center in Washington, and then ultimately the Williams Institute. And there, I did really have a vantage point where I was very explicitly being paid to make sure that my data had salience and my work had salience in the public policy domain. And so it gave me, I think, different than some people who were actually in tenure track positions, it gave me a different perspective on those interplays. And now I make wine. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this talk. So in some ways, some of the earliest work that became queer demography was the famous Kinsey reports. And in large part because it was one of the first really big studies to not pathologize same gender behaviors and attractions. And of course, it was at the time, it was very politically controversial. But I think where those studies really entered the political fray, and is one of the first examples of how, and I should back up and say, this wasn't classic demography. None of these people were demographers. There was a sociologist in there, but this wasn't population-based work that they did. But nonetheless, it was very critical. And one of the ways it became really critical was that, as with Stonewall and the real emergence of very visible LGBT at that time, LGBT or queer activism, there was a need for a number. Activists felt they had to get, which is interesting that shows you how early on there was this recognition that there had to be some quantification here. And so they picked a number out of Kinsey's work, which clearly was not a demographic figure, but it was 10% of males are more or less exclusively homosexual for at least 3 years between the ages of 16 and 55. And they decided that means 10% of the population is queer. That's a little bit of a stretch, but it was it's also one of the first examples of the power of a number to change a movement and to affect a movement. As a kid, as a closeted gay kid in the 70s and 80s, I knew that number. And when I went into a room of 100 people, I remember thinking, oh, there must be 9 other people like me. And it was also a really smart choice, because it was a number that was big enough to matter and not so big to seem really threatening to the big population. So despite the fact that, as I said, it wasn't particularly grounded in super science, it is an early example of how important data and numbers matter to these big public policy debates. So I think one of the first big examples in the US of a proper demographic study of sexuality and gender was the work of Robert Michael and John Gagnon, Edward Lauman, and Gina Collada on the National Health and Social Life Survey, which was also part of the GSS infrastructure at what is now NORC at the University of Chicago. And that was in the early 90s, and they kind of did an expansion of the GSS to focus a lot on sexuality stuff. And they were funded with federal money, and Senator Jesse Helms at the time, a very conservative Republican, decided that wasn't a really good use of federal dollars. And he went after any studies, and in fact, kind of crippled the latter parts of this effort by getting them defunded. And the effects of that and those efforts by more conservative politicians and activists to really go after any kind of scholarship around queer anything lasted for decades. Well into the Obama administration, investigators were still being told by NIH project officers, don't put words like gay, lesbian, sexual orientation, don't put anything like that in a title or an abstract of anything you're applying for. It put an enormous pall over research. And as I said, it lasted really decades, and I'm not sure it's completely gone yet. But it's certainly, as I said, that this was in the early 90s, well into the Obama administration, that advice was still being trumpeted to people to get funding for work. So it really was a challenging aspect of doing this work. So what did we see in their study? So this is from the demography paper, which was kind of the first chapter of my dissertation. And if you look at these numbers carefully, and I'm really not here to go through all these numbers, but what's interesting is how different these results look to the patterns that we see now. This was done in the early 90s. This is an amalgamation of data from the early 90s. You'll see that broadly, men are more likely than women to acknowledge any kind of same-gender sexual activity or a gay or bisexual identity. That's not the case anymore. It's much more women. And my intuition, and the truth is, within that group, these samples were very small, but it was mostly white men who were driving this. And my intuition, which I can't really prove, but I think that was because in these early studies, the people you saw who were in any way identifying with queer sexuality were either people who, for lack of a better word, were sort of so queer that they couldn't hide it, or they were people who had the resources to weather the storm if they were out. And those were primarily white men. And so there was a much higher, I think, a disproportionate group in there than, was sort of perhaps the reality. But nonetheless, as I said, these data look very different. And the transition from this to the patterns we see now was actually pretty rapid. It was only kind of 10, 15 years later, this picture looks dramatically different. So the other big entry into queer data, which was in some ways allowed me to really kick off my career, was that in the 1990 US Census, the Census Bureau decided under the relationship to householder question, so the householder is the person who fills out the form, they separated unmarried partner. In the past, it had been part of, I think, the housemate, roommate, unmarried partner, and they separated that as a category so that you could distinguish between people who were perhaps in a more sexual relationship or a marriage-like relationship, but weren't married. And that was that category of unmarried partner. And of course, they also asked the sex, which this is another argument. I actually think they've never asked sex. They've been always asking gender, and they've just been doing it very poorly. But nonetheless, they asked sex, and you could then use that information to figure out same-sex couples. And my advisors in my dissertation, Seth Sanders, Dan Black, and Lil Taylor, 3 University of Chicago trained economist style, I should say, they weren't all from University of Chicago, but University of Chicago style labor economists. They kind of were one of the early crowds that figured this out. And in fact, the first person who reported on these same-sex couples was a journalist, not a scholar. A journalist figured this out in San Francisco. And one of the first mention of this that we could find in any literature was a newspaper study of this from the early 90s. So anyway, but what this established was that we had this enormous data set. It was the decennial census of a subset of the queer population in the US. And so for the first time, we could start to think about population distributions and show in some respects, and this became much more important later that I'll talk about, but that in fact, queer people were kind of everywhere, to what Christopher was talking about. And that was actually kind of groundbreaking on a lot of dimensions. And in both, in the sense that it was very helpful from an activist standpoint to be able to show that there were queer people everywhere, but it also meant that people who weren't necessarily so happy about queer people being everywhere got riled up. And so that interplay began to emerge with the census data. The 1990 census data didn't make it big into the public domain. That really didn't happen until the 2000 census, and I'll talk about that. But in the early 2000s, as treatments and advances were made in the HIV/AIDS world, and I should say during that whole era, what we would call queer demography was almost entirely focused on HIV and AIDS. Like it was just the prevailing, and perhaps appropriately so, given that epidemic. But nonetheless, as advancements were made in that area, there was a shift. And the shift also politically started to move towards discussions of same-gender relationships and marriage and the policies that go with those. So in 2001, the National Institutes of Health started a set of what I think became 3 conferences called Counting Couples. And at that event, in December of 2001, I was invited because I had published that paper in Demography, and I was working in DC at the Urban Institute. And I remember that the conference started at, say, 8:30, 9 in the morning. it was 2:30 in the afternoon before there was any mention of the fact that a couple could be anything except a man and a woman in some form of relationship. And I think it was Jason Fields, who's still at the Census Bureau now, was the first person to mention. So it took like 6 hours before someone mentioned. But it was, I think, one of the earliest times when you started to have, a big funder like NIH acknowledge this population. So then fast forward to the second counting couples, which occurred I think in late 2003. And that time they actually did a panel because it turned out that the 2000 census data had some challenges around measurement, which I'll mention a little later. And I was to present on some of those challenges. But at the same time, if you know your history around marriage equality in the US, that was the time that Massachusetts, so Vermont had established civil unions, and Massachusetts was about to make marriage equality legal in the state of Massachusetts. And like my sense in 2001 of this group kind of not being particularly excited about the prospect of dealing with same-gender couples, I was very frustrated that I was in a room of some of the most predominant, the marriage and family scholars, the most prominent marriage and family scholars in the United States. You were about to have this major shift in kind of the underlying understanding of marriage, and that group had absolutely nothing to say about it. They were dead quiet. So in a move that many would have argued wasn't my best move from a career standpoint, I decided to tell them that. And I very publicly said, here's what's going on, and it's very frustrating to me that you don't have anything to say about it. And I went on, and poor Wendy Manning here, I think I had unfortunately just heard either a newspaper article or an interview with her. And I said, and look, the stuff that you are saying isn't always helping us, because I said, for example, there was this study of cohabitation and unmarried partnership, and they were talking about the instabilities of those relationships and the precariousness of those relationships. And nowhere in there did you say, but that only applies to different gender couples, that we actually didn't study whether these characteristics are true of same-gender couples. And that kind of thinking is, in fact, undermining our ability to make the argument that same-gender couples are in stable and long-term relationships, even in the absence of marriage. So I gave my little speech. I was met with fairly dead silence, and then I did my talk, and I have no idea sort of the broad impact of that, but I can say that within a decade of that, there was a dramatic shift in the participation of these family and marriage scholars in particularly the marriage equality debate. The amicus brief in the American Sociological Association and several other organizations scholarly organizations got very engaged in that debate. So we did kind of get it turned around, but at that time it was a rough go. So the 2000 census, then the release of the 2000 census and the same-gender couples data became, to the absolute surprise of the Census Bureau, became, I believe, the biggest story out of the 2000 census. Every week when they released those data, local newspapers, they would release in batches of states. The press in those states were like, what are the same-gender couple numbers? Like that's what they focused on. And so it became a huge story. It was the data I used for my book, The Gay and Lesbian Atlas. And as I said, it was a way then that we could start to really show the geographic distribution of at least a subset of the queer population. And shockingly, the West Coast and New England tended to have the highest concentrations. But nonetheless, it made a big difference in our ability to understand at least where these populations were. But it also started to really help in actually challenging myths and misperceptions about the population. So some examples, at that time, the two big topics were Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was participation of queer people in the military, and marriage. And it turned out we could use those data to argue that, in fact, there were gay and lesbian and bisexual people in the military, even despite a prohibition against them being open about that in military service. An article by Amanda and Dudley posted about the economic cost of being gay, and this idea that there was a very persistent myth that gay men were very wealthy. And that, it turned out, in all of the census data, was men in same gender couples relative to men in different sex gender couples were almost always economically disadvantaged. Now, they didn't have children, so in fact, they may have been able to spend their money differently, which maybe then made it appear that there was perhaps wealth, but they were actually still clearly earning less than their different gender couple counterparts. And then one of the biggest things as the marriage equality started was the presence of children. People were absolutely flummoxed to find out that same gender couples were raising kids. And where were they doing it? In Alabama, in Louisiana, in Georgia, in the deep, deep South. And the reason, and so census put out a figure saying that a third of same gender couples had kids under 18 in the home. Now, the reason they tended to be high in the South was that a huge portion of that raising of children where people had children young, probably with a different gender partner, have now, come out, or they're now partnered with the same gender partner, and they have those kids. And of course, where is that most likely to happen? In places where people are more hidden about their identities, who come out later in life, and that tends to be in the most conservative parts of the country. So I think that was the broad story there. But nonetheless, the idea that there were all these households with kids was jarring. The other kind of anecdotal story I'll tell you is that this was jarring also because this really was a hidden population. So when a New York Times reporter saw some of the work I was doing, she was like, I want to go find these people in the South who have these kids. And so she called the various LGBT organizations in the States. They couldn't find any of them, literally nothing. They couldn't find couples with kids because none of them were engaged with HRC or the big movement organizations. Where did she end up finding them? Churches. So she found them in churches that were friendly to the queer population, and she finally found some couples. And of course, they were couples who did match this kind of description. They were often, they were disproportionately racial and ethnic minorities. They were certainly not economically very well off. So again, they defied a lot of these stereotypes that we had about the queer population. So eventually, through the aughts, you get this shift of marriage becoming really the behemoth in the room of queer activism. And obviously the cause celeb of that in the late aughts was Prop 8 in California. For those of you who don't remember, when Obama was being elected president, at the same time, California passed a constitutional amendment that banned marriage equality in the state. And so that was challenged as being inconsistent with the entire rest of the California Constitution. And the judge decided to hold a trial. And so both sides decided to try to get scholars to talk about this. And on the marriage equality side, there was a plethora of social scientists, but it included my colleagues at the Williams Institute, Lee Badgett, who was a well-known economist at the time, and Ilan Meyer, who is a psychologist and has done amazing work around queer populations, and particularly stigma and discrimination. So, but on the other side, they literally couldn't find anybody. And so the only guy they got was a guy named David Blankenhorn, who wasn't a PhD scholar. He was really a kind of marriage activist. He had sort of a history background. And in his testimony, he decided to acknowledge that, in fact, there were all these positive benefits of marriage equality. So he acknowledged that same-sex couple would be economically better off, that would be better for the kids, and that their health and well-being outcomes would probably be better if we did this. And then said, oh, but we shouldn't do it. So, you know, the judge just kind of like said, this guy wasn't worth the bother. They eventually won this, they certainly won this case in California. In the Supreme Court, this case, and it won, but it won completely on a technicality. The Supreme Court didn't rule broadly on the issue of marriage equality with this case. They basically ruled that the people who brought the case didn't have standing. And so the California ruling, Supreme Court ruling stood in this case. So marriage was brought to California. But then again, in the early beginnings of the teens, or the decade, the marriage equality started to win in the US courts finally. And then actually they started to win at the ballot box as well. And so in 2012, it was like a complete opposite of 2004 and 2008. The various referendums and amendments that were proposed on ballots in, I think it was 7 or 8 states, they all won in 2012. So there was this really rapid shift. But marriage went on trial again. And this time it went on trial in Michigan. And April DeBoer and Jane Rouse were a couple in Michigan. They were both NICU nurses. They had adopted children. All these kids had kind of rough starts. And the challenge was they couldn't jointly be the parents of their own children. So the only way you could jointly adopt in Michigan was to be married. And they couldn't get married. So the judge in the case, who was a Reagan appointee, said, look, I can rule on this, but your best way to do this is to challenge the marriage statute. So that's what they did. And surprising to everyone, he ordered a trial. This time, it was a little different because in the interim, after Prop 8, more conservative scholars than just the conservative political wing said, look, we have to fix this problem that we don't have people who can talk about this. So they decided to fund research and find scholars who could challenge the scholars who were on the marriage equality side, who were saying this just has all these good benefits and here's, you know, this is why we should have marriage equality. And so there was suddenly now sort of two sides of the coin here in the trial. So the question is, well, how do you go about getting this research published? Because they had to do it pretty fast. So a guy named Mark Rigneris, who is a professor at UT Austin, sociology. And how do you get published really fast? Well, first of all, you submit your paper to a journal before you've even completed your data collection. And you just wait for that pesky revise and resubmit to actually finish the data collection and write a paper that includes all the full data. They submit it, it's kind of small numbers. So you can see they submitted this paper in February and got it fully approved in March. I dare say there are not very many of us who have submitted to any journal and gotten a review and then a second review and an acceptance in 6 weeks. Something's a little fishy on that. So secondly, you managed to get 2 out of the 3 peer reviewers on your payroll. So 2 out of the 3 reviewers were actually paid consultants of the study. So in short, they cheated. They flat out cheated the system. And it was Mark and it was a set of others, pretty prominent scholars, who kind of rigged the process. And they got this paper and they made big hay out of it in conservative media. And so Rigneris became the star witness on their side in the Michigan case. So how did that turn out? Well, thankfully not very well. So by this time, as I said, there was a lot of engagement from the broader sociology community. In fact, the day before his testimony, his colleagues at the University of Texas Austin issued a statement kind of saying, this is not our opinion. We want nothing to do with this. It very much undermined his testimony at the time. But the court really ruled that they were unable, this judge said, they were unable to afford any of these testimonies much weight. In part because one of the other people who testified, Doug Allen, who's an economist from Canada, was asked, is it accurate that you believe the consequence of engaging in homosexual acts is a separation from God and eternal damnation? In other words, they're going to hell. And his answer under oath was, without repentance, yes. So that kind of really highlighted where the kind of perspective that this side was coming from on these issues. And and I would particularly call out Michael Rosenfeld, a sociologist from Stanford, really provide a testimony to just undermine all of the basic things that Regnerus did wrong in his paper. And it really did establish the fact that the social science disciplines were quite united on this view that child rearing among same-gender couples wasn't inherently, there was no reason to believe this was inherently harmful to children. And so won this case in Michigan, lost it on appeal at the next level of the courts, and then eventually won it in the Supreme Court. But to show you exactly how much these data matter, the Supreme Court ruling was made by Justice Kennedy, who again was a very conservative member of the court. And this is what he had to say about his decision.
You have been a strong advocate that everybody should be treated equally and that there should be no discrimination. And in fact, you authored the opinion that allowed gay marriage to occur. Is that something that surprised your conservative, let's say, supporters? And is this something you're very proud of having written that opinion?
In a sense, it surprised me.
What surprised you?
The outcome.
The reaction, or but not your decision?
Well, you know, because my religious beliefs, that's one of the reasons I wrote it. It seemed to me that I couldn't hide. And the nature of injustice is you can't see it in your own time. And as we thought about this, and I thought about it more and more, it seemed to me that just wrong under the Constitution to say that over 100,000 adopted children of gay parents could not have their parents married. I just thought that this was wrong, but it took, and I struggled with it and wrote the case over a weekend. That's the way that came out. But as I say, as you write, the reasons either compel themselves or not.
So it's a great example of, like, the 10%. It was that 100,000 number was a number that stuck in his craw. Like, and 100,000, let's be clear, in a population of 330 million in the United States is not actually that big of a number, but it mattered. I'm delighted that I was the one who promulgated that number, but it was, I was sort of quite taken aback when I heard this interview, because I didn't realize quite the effect that had and it's just really a classic example of why this work that we're doing really matters and can make an enormous difference. And you never quite know how that will happen, but in this case, because I'm not sure I fully agree with him that you can't see injustice in your own time. I think we do a better job of that than some might suggest, but nonetheless, it definitely was something that I think made a huge difference. So what's interesting is it made a difference, even though these same-gender couple data were really crappy data. Census came out with a test. So there was a thing called a false positive problem, whereby if a different gender couple accidentally checked the wrong sex box, even at very tiny rates, because there weren't that many same-gender couples, suddenly that same-gender sample could be swamped with actually different gender married couples. And turned out Census's own analysis was like a third of those couples were probably different gender married couples. And we knew about this problem, and in my work, I did a lot of ways to try to correct for that issue, to try to weed out these couples, but nonetheless, it was something we really struggled with. And the solution, which this is another interesting interplay of science and policy. So the census knew the answer to this problem in 2005, when we the early aughts, when we identified it. The answer was to put the same-sex designation into the response categories of the household. That's what Canada did. It's what the UK did. It's what Australia did. It's what New Zealand did. They were all doing it. Census couldn't put those terms in a form. It was too politically, it just couldn't happen. So it was 2018 until this got added to the American Community Survey. 15 years. And there was no science behind that delay. That delay was because of politics. And it wasn't until after the marriage equality ruling that they felt comfortable doing this. And prior to the marriage equality, when there was a Defense of Marriage Act and all that kind of stuff that made this all really dicey, there was no way, no matter how much science you gave to them. And we had big meetings, Wendy was involved with these, to try to figure this out. And that it made no difference. It had to wait for the politics to catch up. So in the meantime, there were more surveys starting to do actual sexual orientation and gender identity questions. One of the most fun things, I published a paper in 2012, I think, or 2011. And this is a 6-page paper from the Williams Institute that has been cited now nearly 2,000 times. And it just goes to show that you don't always have to do peer review stuff, because this stuff wouldn't have been published in a peer reviewed journal. Like it was just very simple math to kind of average across a bunch of surveys. And I suggested that 3.5% of the population I identified as LGB in the US. And the fun part for me was that I got pictured next to Kinsey. So the big story was, it's not 10%. That was the big story of this study. And so I got to the degree that conservatives paid any attention to this, they were delighted with that story. So they didn't critique me. Who did critique me? The queer community. So Larry Kramer, who many of you know, is a very curmudgeon-y, very, very successful activist in the HIV/AIDS domain, said that this guy says all this and everyone falls on their knees to kiss his feet. Would that were true. Whatever the definition of us, there are far more of us than the present day methodology can entertain, that I should go away, play with someone else's lives, and shut up. So, and I put that out because in all of my career, all of my critiques came from queer activists. Those were the people who went after me. And if you're doing this work, you have to be prepared for that. It's a very fraught world, and these are a lot of very vulnerable people, and they're very concerned, and they're the ones paying attention. And so they tend to be the critiques. And that's very difficult when you're a queer person to have, that's the people who are going after you. But it absolutely was the crowd that went after my work on a pretty routine basis. The activist community, the other big thing that happened with 2000 and the census data, it was the realization that demographic data could be helpful. Prior to that, there was enormous concerns about collecting data, legitimate concerns about confidentiality and the numbers just being so infinitesimally small, all of that kind of thing. But the effect of the census data and then publication of this study showed that there was an appetite for this work, and again, that it actually could be helpful. Because I really believe that in all of my work, it almost never mattered what the number was. It mattered that there was a number. The visibility piece mattered. So throughout the kind of teens, then we actually did have expansion. This is mostly focused, two of these on the federal government in the US. The National Health and Interview Survey, the National Survey for Family Growth, and then the NCVS, the National Crime and Victimization Survey, which I think is still the only large federal data set that collects both gender identity and sexual orientation data in a representative sample of adults. And in fact, they did it for young people as well in the NCVS. But you'll note that we still don't have any Census Bureau data products that have these questions. The other real game changer was in part because of all the kind of publicity around my estimate. Gallup got very interested in this study, and they called me and they said, we want to add this to our nightly survey. they had a survey where every night 500 people were surveyed in the US on a bunch of topics. And for the first time, 500 people in the United States every night had to answer the question, do you personally identify as gay, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? So it was a single item, yes or no. Obviously not the most ideal way to ask this question, but nonetheless, we suddenly had a sample that any of these other federal resources didn't come close to getting. Gallup was collecting enormous amounts of data. And it turned out, and so what we've seen there is, those numbers in the last decade have gone from, their first estimate, shockingly, was around 3.5%. Where'd they get that number from? And it's now more than, it's doubled, more than doubled now. It's now starting to get close to 8% for identity measurement. And they've changed the question, improved the question, and partly the reason they improved the question is that scholars started to say, hey, we can use these Gallup data to do very specific samples of queer populations. So Elan Meyer and colleagues at the Williams Institute, Jody Herman with some of the trans stuff, and Claire Campdush at Minnesota with Wendy Enchat. These are samples specifically of queer populations, and they were able to use the Gallup data to provide weighting and other things to make these data collections population based. These three studies, I think, are $6 or $7 million of federal funding in these studies. So they're very important studies. And interestingly, they're relying on a private data source to do it. There's no federal data source that you could do these studies with. I should also argue that makes these studies incredibly expensive because Gallup charges for all of that work in ways that the federal government wouldn't if you had better data. So politics clearly remains a factor. So even at the onset of the Trump administration, there was a very early incident of a report being pulled that suggested census was going to consider the idea of sexual orientation and gender identity questions. And the accusation from the LGBT community, the queer activist community, was that Trump is taking sexual orientation out of the census, which was not true. There was no possibility of these questions making it into the census or the ACS. In 2016, there's no way to propose a question then and get it on a sample into that. Those decisions were all done already, what was going to be on those surveys. But it was used politically to say this is bad for us. And now, finally, in 2023, 2024, Census is studying adding sexual orientation and gender identity to the American Community Survey. But again, it took, they had to get past, so even though I don't think Trump administration did that, Trump administration certainly made it clear you can't touch these topics. And so everything got put on hold for that time. And so it's now finally happening in the Bureau, and it's still going to take years before anything actually gets on the survey. So my closing thoughts are, 1, data matters. 2, please, perfect is the enemy of the good here. There's lots of issues, and we're going to hear about it today, of how to collect these data, and they're all valid issues. But we need to not let those issues completely stymie us from collecting. It is critical that we expand these data resources because they really do matter. And when science gets political, we have to stick to our guns and say we need to stick to the science. And I would argue that in this brief 15, 20-year history that I've had, that is the strategy that has worked so far. And there's no question to me, with all of this work, all of the bad stuff that's happening around gender identity in particular, we need scholarship to challenge that and to show that science has something to say about this. So again, I thank you all very much for listening to me. Sláinte Bróid means pride in Irish. So I thank you all, and I look forward to the day.
Oh, so then although we got started a little bit late, so we'll take 5 minutes to also offer questions and stuff. Questions. for Dr. Gates from the audience, also from online as well. So if anyone has questions or reflections for the talk, please raise your hand.
Professor Dr. Gates, thank you so much for your talk. I love it. I remember years ago when you gave a version of this information at the University of Michigan, you shared a tidbit. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about when reassigning those couples that mark themselves looking like same-gender couples. Is it true that part of that work was looking at the names?
Yes, so the way the
whether...
census did it
Yeah.
was that they have, obviously they have an entire decennial census in which they have first names and sex. And so there's probabilities attached to every name as to whether you're male or female. And that's how they tried to determine this thing of how many were wrong. Now, researchers wouldn't be able to do that because we would never have access to those names. But that was the way they did it. But again, that took them, the other side of that story is Census blackballed our paper originally that showed this problem. They told Demography this is not a problem and we can't confirm. This was in like 2003 or 2004. We could not get that paper published because Census said it wasn't a problem. And then 7 years later, they said, oh, oops, it actually is a problem. So again, but that happened, to be fair, that happened through genuine collaboration between us and the Census Bureau. Like that's how we got them on board. We really engaged with them and said, you need to help us sort this out. Yeah.
So I love your work, it's been hugely important, and this was great. It was one thing that struck me as a bit off, which is you said about Regnerus that he belongs to a church that's anti-queer. And the second one was he's biased.
Oh, I don't know. I didn't mean to say that if I did. He got funding from conservative sources.
Okay.
I don't know about his own church and that issue. I would argue he was biased. I don't have any idea whether that was because of his religious background.
Okay, but you mentioned people who belong to churches that are pro-queer can also.
Of course.
Yeah. So, I mean, you said data matters. I think it's better to stick to data than question motives, because people on the other side will do that too, and then we don't.
Oh no, that's totally a fair point. I agree, and I always argue during that time, like we have to be very careful about saying they're being funded by conservative organizations because we're being funded by non-conservative organizations. You know, I mean that's and I fully agree. And so if that's how it sounded, that really honestly wasn't what I meant. I do believe he was funded by conservative organizations. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing per se. And I agree with you that the data matters. But yes, that's totally fair point. I agree. The other quick comment I'll say that I kind of forgot to say as I'm thinking about it is another aspect that happened with the kind of federal kind of avoiding these topics was like in my era, students were constantly being told, you can't have this as your main topic. And if you're doing this, like you have to make sure that this has some relevance to some other broad topic. And this is career suicide if you put all your eggs in this basket. I think that's improved a lot now, but I think it's not fully gone from and I think it's something that we have to constantly challenge when we're working with students to say this is in itself a very important study. And yes, of course, if you can make connections to broad, that's great, but we don't put that restriction on everybody else and their work. And so I think this is work that matters in its own, and I think we have to constantly tell our students that that's the case.
Then actually, we'll do one last,
Okay.
Donnie, you can go for the last question, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this great talk. I was very curious about your question or your comment about how we're usually measuring gender,
Yes.
not sex. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it's, you know, whether we're measuring sex or gender really has to do with how the people seeing that question interpret and what answer they give. And all of the evidence is that a trans man or a trans woman, if you're presented with an option that says, are you male or female? they'll pick their gender. That's now, you know, there's still huge problems because it's binary and all, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about that today. But I believe that the answer to that question is almost exclusive. I don't think people suddenly think, oh, I have to tell the census what my sex assigned at birth. I just really don't think that's how people interpret. That makes no sense to me that people would interpret that. And in fact, all the anecdotal information that I've heard is that that's not the case. And so I think it's all of these things that we've been calling sex questions are gender questions, and they're just bad gender questions. But Delane, did you have a? I saw a hand.
I have,
That's the last one.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah.
well, I was just gonna say, I have my students ask this question of trans people, maybe their trans project.
Yeah.
And we were finding that most trans individuals will you draw on what their like, they feel like their quote federal ID is.
Oh,
So
okay.
they actually align their
Got it.
their
With-
federal identification. So like if they have what their passport says, with their license,
Yeah.
they'll do it with driver's license too. So like their state info. But I will also say that in 2010, if you called the census and said, I'm trans, how should I use this question? They responded with, you should answer how you live,
You're right.
which is actually a very progressive answer.
And means that the answer is
Because I
more a
call
gender question, the gender answer than what we would traditionally say. So again, thank you, everybody.